The autumn of 1775 brought a bitter wind to Willow Creek, Massachusetts, carrying with it both fallen leaves and whispers of revolution. Martha Lawson stood on the porch of her modest farmhouse, watching her 3 children, James, Abigail, and young Thomas, gathering the last of the season's apples. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their 20 acres, illuminating the red and gold fruit still clinging to gnarled branches. 6 months had passed since her husband Samuel fell ill and died, leaving her alone to manage their farm and raise their children in increasingly troubled times. Martha pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she spotted an unfamiliar figure approaching on horseback along the winding dirt road. The rider's posture was unmistakably military, back straight, shoulders squared, though he wore simple civilian clothes beneath a heavy traveling cloak. Captain Nathaniel Hayes of the colonial militia dismounted at her gate with a fluid grace that spoke of years at sea before joining the Patriot cause. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing dark hair streaked with premature grey. His face, weathered by wind and worry, softened when he saw the children working in the orchard. "Mrs. Lawson," he inquired, his voice gentler than his imposing frame suggested. "I've come on behalf of the Continental Congress. Word has reached us about your situation." Martha straightened her spine, unwilling to appear vulnerable before. This stranger, despite the anxiety that had been her constant companion since Samuel's passing. "What situation might that be, Captain?" she asked, noting the insignia partially concealed beneath his cloak. "The British tax collectors," he replied, glancing briefly toward the road to ensure they remained alone. "We've heard they plan to seize your property for unpaid taxes and turn it into a supply depot for their troops arriving from Boston." Martha's heart sank like a stone in a well. She had been struggling to pay the increasingly punitive taxes imposed by the Crown, selling family heirlooms and taking in mending work from neighbors, but had hoped for more time. "They can't simply take our home," she whispered, though she knew full well they could and would. "They've done it to 3 families north of here already," Captain Hayes confirmed, his eyes reflecting her concern. "The Millers, the Abbotts, and the Winslow widow were all given less than a week to vacate. But the Continental Congress believes every acre of American soil is worth fighting for, not with muskets, but with wits and determination." Martha glanced toward her children, who had paused in their work to observe the stranger. James, her eldest at 12, stood protectively near his siblings, his father's wooden pruning knife gripped tightly in his hand. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside, Captain," she suggested, calling to the children to bring in the day's harvest. The farmhouse kitchen was warm from the hearth fire and fragrant with the smell of baking bread, Martha's attempt at normalcy in increasingly uncertain times. After settling the children with chores at the far end of the room, she poured the captain a mug of hot cider, noting how his eyes took in every detail of their home. The well-worn furniture, the carefully mended curtains, the miniature portrait of Samuel that hung beside the fireplace. "Your reputation precedes you, Mrs. Lawson," Hayes said quietly. "Your neighbors speak highly of your resilience since your husband's passing." "Necessity breeds adaptation, Captain," Martha replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "But resilience won't stop British soldiers from forcing us from our home." That evening, after the children were asleep in the loft above, Martha and Captain Hayes sat at her kitchen table reviewing documents by candlelight. The notice of seizure would arrive within a week, giving her just days to vacate or face forcible removal. The British authorities had already earmarked her property, its location at the crossroads between Boston and the Western Territories, making it strategically valuable. "Your husband was a shipbuilder, correct?" the captain asked, studying Samuel's ledgers with interest. "Yes, he moved inland when we married, but maintained connections with the maritime trade. He taught the craft to James, though at 12 he's still learning." And you maintain this orchard and these fields yourself? Martha nodded, unconsciously rubbing the calluses on her palms. With the children's help, we provide apples and grain to half the county. Samuel always said this land had the perfect combination of soil and sunlight for growing things. Captain Hayes leaned forward, his expression intense in the flickering candlelight. Mrs. Lawson, what the British don't realize is that this revolution isn't just being fought by men with weapons. It's being fought by families like yours, who feed our people and maintain our way of life. What can one widow possibly do against the British Empire? Martha asked, voicing the helplessness that had kept her awake for too many nights. Hayes smiled, for the first time since arriving, transforming his severe features into something almost boyish. You've already done more than you know. Your farm sits at a critical juncture. The Continental Army needs food, intelligence, and safe passage, all of which you're uniquely positioned to provide. You want to use my farm for the Patriot cause? Martha realized, unsure whether to feel honored or terrified by the prospect. I want to save your farm by making it indispensable to both sides, Hayes clarified, tracing his finger along a rough map spread between them. The British need food as much as we do. If they believe they can get what they need without seizing your property. Martha considered his words carefully, mindful of the children sleeping above. You're suggesting I appear neutral to protect my children while secretly supporting independence. Many of our most valuable patriots never fire a shot, Mrs. Lawson. They fight with ledgers, crops, and strategic information. Your farm could become a trading post, officially selling to both sides, but quietly serving the cause of liberty. As the night deepened, they refined their plan. Captain Hayes would arrange for Patriot sympathizers in Boston to pay Martha's back taxes through a complex arrangement of merchants and bankers, disguised as British merchants seeking favorable trading terms. Meanwhile, Martha would establish her farm as a neutral trading post where both sides could purchase provisions, while secretly ensuring the colonial forces received critical intelligence about British movements. This won't be without risk, Hayes warned, as dawn approached and he prepared to leave. You'll be walking a dangerous line. Martha looked toward the ceiling, thinking of her children asleep above. When Samuel died, I promised him I would keep our family and our home safe. If this is how I must do it, then so be it. Hayes placed his hat on his head, studying her with newfound respect. I believe Samuel would be proud of your courage, Mrs. Lawson. As Captain Hayes rode away in the grey morning light, Martha watched. The sun rise over her apple orchard, the trees her husband had planted a decade earlier, now heavy with fruit. For the first time since becoming a widow, she felt something beyond grief and fear, a sense of purpose that connected her small farm to the greater fight for liberty unfolding across the colonies. What she couldn't know was how crucial her role would become in the months ahead, or how her quiet heroism would help shape a nation's future. Winter descended upon Willow Creek with unforgiving cold, transforming Martha Lawson's farm into a landscape of pristine white, broken only by the dark silhouettes of dormant apple trees. Despite the harsh weather, the farmhouse bustled with unprecedented activity. Her neutral trading post had become exactly what Captain Hayes had envisioned, a vital supply point frequented by both British officers seeking comfort far from Boston and Continental soldiers discreetly acquiring provisions, each unaware of the other's patronage, thanks to Martha's careful scheduling and diplomatic discretion. In her barn, hidden beneath a false floor James had ingeniously constructed beneath the hay storage, Martha kept two ledgers. One recorded official transactions, showing modest but legal profits from selling provisions, cider, and wool mittens knitted by Abigail. The second, written in a code developed by Hayes using maritime terminology that reflected Samuel's former profession, Detailed troop movements, supply chains, and strategic information gathered from unsuspecting British officers who spoke freely over hot cider in her kitchen. The cold had cracked the skin on Martha's hands, leaving them raw and red, despite the protective balm she applied nightly. Yet she found herself working more diligently than ever before. There was purpose in her exhaustion now. Each loaf of bread, each repaired uniform, each carefully transcribed conversation potentially bringing independence closer to reality. "Mother, Lieutenant Caldwell is approaching," 12-year-old James called from his lookout post by the window one February afternoon. The British officer had become a regular visitor, his fondness for Martha's apple pies and the warmth of her hearth making him particularly talkative about military matters. "Thank you, James. Please take Thomas and Abigail to the cellar to sort. The preserves." What remained unspoken was that the children would listen through the floorboards, young ears catching details adult soldiers might miss. In the months since Hayes's first visit, Martha had discovered her children's aptitude for this clandestine work. Thomas, at 7, could remember conversations verbatim. Abigail had developed an uncanny ability to interpret the meaning behind casual remarks. James had become adept at crafting hiding places throughout the property. Lieutenant Caldwell stamped snow from his boots at the door, his red uniform partially concealed beneath a heavy cloak. "Mrs. Lawson, a blessing to find warmth on such a day." His breath formed clouds in the cold air as he handed her a small package wrapped in oilcloth. "Sugar, as promised, arrived from England yesterday on the Meridian." "How thoughtful. I've your usual order prepared, and something extra." Martha gestured to a basket of provisions, salted meat, bread and dried apples, and the fresh-baked pie beside it. "The children insisted I set aside the best of our winter stores for you." The lieutenant settled by the fire, accepting a steaming mug. "Your hospitality makes these colonial postings bearable. If only all Americans were as reasonable as you." He sighed, removing his gloves. "The situation in Boston grows more tense by the day. We're simple people, Lieutenant. Farmers need peace to work our lands, regardless of who governs." Martha kept her tone neutral, though beneath her apron her free hand clenched into a fist. "Precisely why General Howe appreciates establishments like yours. In fact," he leaned closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a great secret, "I've been authorized to inform you that your tax situation has been formally resolved. Your property is no longer under consideration for seizure." Martha allowed genuine relief to show on her face. Hayes's plan had worked. "That's wonderful news." "Indeed. The Crown recognizes the value of cooperative colonists. Speaking of which, a supply convoy will pass through next Thursday. I would advise you to prepare extra stores for purchase, 30 wagons at least with escort." He tapped the side of his nose knowingly. "For a favored trader such as yourself, this represents an excellent opportunity." After Caldwell departed, his silhouette disappearing into the swirling snow, Martha waited until nightfall before retrieving her secret ledger. This information about the convoy could prove invaluable to the Continental forces. 30 wagons would contain enough supplies to sustain a British regiment for months. She worked by candlelight, her children asleep upstairs, documenting every detail shared by the unwitting officer. A soft knock at her window startled her. Outside stood a woman Martha recognized from town, Sarah Fletcher, a seamstress whose husband had disappeared early in the conflict. Sarah occasionally delivered messages from Hayes, her status as a seemingly apolitical widow, making her movements less suspicious to British observers. "He's been captured," Sarah whispered, after Martha let her in through the back door. Her cloak was crusted with ice, her face pinched with cold and fear. "Captain Hayes was taken near Boston 3 days ago." Martha's blood ran cold. "Do they know about his network, about this farm?" We don't believe so, but his regular contacts will be watched. I've been sent to warn you and retrieve any intelligence." Martha's hands trembled as she handed over her coded ledger. "There's information about a convoy next Thursday, 30 wagons, military escort." Sarah nodded, concealing the small book within her dress. "There's more. Before his capture, Hayes arranged something for you." She pulled a folded document from her cloak, sealed with wax. "Official recognition of your farm's tax settlement, signed by officials sympathetic to our cause, but placed within British administration. Even if they discover Hayes' connection to you, they cannot legally seize this property now." Tears filled Martha's eyes as she accepted the document. "He kept his promise. He said to tell you that your apple trees will see liberty bloom in America." Sarah's voice softened. "He speaks of you with great respect, Mrs. Lawson." After Sarah departed, disappearing into the night as silently as she had arrived, Martha gathered her children from the cellar. As they sat before the fire, sharing a simple meal of bread and stew, she told them stories of their father's dreams for America, a place where people governed themselves and determined their own futures. "Are we helping make that happen, Mother?" Abigail asked, her small face serious in the firelight. Martha smoothed her daughter's hair, noticing how much she resembled Samuel around the eyes. "Yes, my love. In our own small way, we are helping birth a nation." That night, as snow blanketed her orchard in pristine white, Martha sat at her table with paper and quill, composing a letter she might never be able to send to the imprisoned. Captain Hayes. She thanked him not just for saving her farm, but for showing her family how ordinary people, women and children included, could contribute to extraordinary change. Outside, the winter wind carried the distant sounds of marching men. The war continued, and with it, Martha's quiet resistance from her kitchen table at Willow Creek Farm, a resistance that required no weapons, only courage, conviction, and the determination to preserve both her family's legacy and her nation's future. If you enjoyed this story of American courage and sacrifice, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of heroism throughout history. Spring 1776 arrived at Willow Creek with new life and renewed hope. Martha Lawson's apple trees burst into delicate white blossoms. Their sweet fragrance carried on warming breezes that seemed to promise abundance despite the continuing conflict. 4 months had passed since Captain Hayes' capture, and while occasional messages confirmed he remained alive in British custody in Boston, his absence had forced Martha to adapt and expand her role in the Patriot network. Her farm had become more than a trading post. It was now a way station on an underground route, moving information, supplies, and occasionally people through the countryside. What had begun as a desperate measure to save her home had evolved into a calling that connected her family to the larger struggle for independence. Martha found herself hosting clandestine meetings after midnight, hiding continental messengers in her root cellar and using a series of lantern signals to indicate whether British patrols were active nearby. James, now 13, had taken to accompanying trusted merchants on deliveries, his youthful appearance making him an ideal courier for messages concealed within innocent packages. Abigail, 10, had developed a talent for distracting visiting officials with childish questions, while Martha examined papers left carelessly on tables. Even 7-year-old Thomas contributed by memorizing the insignia of different British regiments, providing valuable intelligence about which units were being deployed where. "Mother, look!" Abigail pointed excitedly toward the road one April morning, pausing in her task of collecting eggs from the henhouse. A familiar figure approached on horseback. Not Captain Hayes, but Colonel William Preston of the Continental Army, who had taken over management of Hayes' intelligence network following his capture. Preston's occasional visits were always conducted under the pretense of purchasing provisions for his estate several counties over. Mrs. Lawson, Preston greeted her formally as he dismounted, maintaining their pretense of casual acquaintance for any watching eyes. His uniform was concealed beneath civilian attire, but Martha noted the military precision in his movements. "I've come to inquire about purchasing provisions for the spring planting season." Once inside the farmhouse, with James posted as lookout near the window, Preston's demeanor changed entirely. "We've received word from Philadelphia," he said in a hushed tone, accepting the cup of dandelion tea Martha offered. "The Continental Congress is preparing to vote on independence, a complete and formal break from Britain." Martha gasped, nearly dropping the pot she held. "When?" "Early July, if all proceeds as planned. John Adams believes the resolution will pass despite opposition from some representatives." Preston leaned forward, lowering his voice further. "But there's more, immediate news that concerns you directly." He withdrew a folded paper from his coat, sealed with wax. "Captain Hayes has escaped British custody." Martha's hand flew to her, heart spilling tea onto the table unnoticed. "Thank Providence. Is he safe?" "He made it to Continental lines 3 days ago," Preston confirmed. "Weak from his confinement but otherwise unharmed. But his identity is now known to the British. His previous contacts, including this farm, may come under renewed scrutiny." "We've always known that risk," Martha said, resolution in her voice as she wiped up the spilled tea. The months of clandestine activity had changed her, burning away hesitation and fear, leaving behind a steely determination. "What would you have us do?" Hayes himself sent specific instructions. Preston unfolded the paper, revealing a detailed message written in Hayes' distinctive hand. "He suggests temporarily shutting down your operations here and relocating your family to Philadelphia until the declaration is ratified. He's concerned the British may connect you to his escape." Martha stared out the window at her blossoming orchard, the white flowers luminous against the blue spring sky. The trees her husband had planted, that she had fought so hard to keep. "Leave the farm, now, after everything we've done to protect it?" Preston's expression was sympathetic but firm. "It would be temporary, Mrs. Lawson. Hayes believes events are accelerating, that we're approaching a point where secrecy will give way to open declaration. Once America formally announces its independence, your role would change accordingly." Martha poured herself a measure of the hard cider she kept for medicinal purposes, needing its fortifying warmth. "And if independence fails, if the declaration is not ratified, then we adapt again," Preston replied simply, "as we have always done." That evening, Martha gathered James, Abigail, and Thomas around the kitchen table. The remains of their supper, a rabbit stew with early spring vegetables, sat, forgotten as she explained the situation. "We may need to leave our home for a short while," she said gently, watching their young faces process this news. "Because of the war?" Thomas asked, his small fingers tracing the wood grain of the table. "Because of the birth of something new," Martha corrected, reaching out to smooth his unruly hair. "Something your father believed in, a nation where people like us have a voice." James, increasingly aware of their precarious situation, asked the question that weighed on all their minds. "What if we lose the farm while we're gone? What if we lose everything Father built?" Martha took her son's hand, noting how much it had grown over the winter, no longer a child's hand, but showing the first signs of the man he would become. "Your father didn't just build a farm, James. He built a family. And what makes a home isn't the land or the buildings. It's the people who share their lives there." The following days were filled with preparations. Martha entrusted her closest neighbor, an elderly couple sympathetic to independence, with caring for the essential aspects of the farm. Colonel Preston arranged for a wagon to transport them to Philadelphia, where they would stay with Hayes's sister until the political situation clarified. Each child was permitted one small bundle of personal belongings. Martha packed Samuel's Bible, his letters, and the document that had saved their farm from seizure. On their final evening at Willow Creek, Martha walked through her orchard alone. As twilight descended, touching the rough bark of trees Samuel had planted with such hope for the future. She remembered her fear when Captain Hayes had first arrived with news of the impending seizure. How far they had come since then, from a widow desperate to save her inheritance to a woman willingly risking that same property for a cause greater than herself. As the spring stars began to appear overhead, she noticed James had followed her into the orchard. "Mother," he said, a new maturity in his voice, "I've been thinking about what you said, about home being the people, not the place." Martha nodded, waiting for him to continue. "But this land is still part of who we are," he continued, gesturing to the blossoming trees surrounding them. "These trees, they'll keep growing while we're gone. They'll bear fruit, whether we're here to harvest it or not." "Yes, they will," Martha agreed, hearing Samuel's practical wisdom in her son's words. James reached into his pocket and withdrew a handful of apple seeds he'd collected from last autumn's harvest. "I thought maybe we should take these with us, to plant wherever we end up, even if it's just temporary, a piece of Willow Creek to keep with us." Martha embraced her son, tears welling in her eyes, despite her resolve to remain strong for her. "Children, your father would be so proud of the young man you're becoming." At dawn, the Lawson family loaded their wagon with only what they could carry: clothes, family heirlooms, Martha's spinning wheel, and a small leather pouch of apple seeds. As they prepared to depart, a rider appeared on the road, not in military uniform, but in simple civilian clothes that had seen hard use. Captain Nathaniel Hayes, thinner than when she'd last seen him and with a new scar along his jawline, dismounted at their gate. "You were supposed to meet us in Philadelphia," Martha exclaimed, unable to hide her joy at seeing him safe. Hayes smiled, the months of imprisonment evident in new lines on his face, but not in his spirit. "I couldn't let you make this journey without proper escort. Besides," he added, his voice softening, "I wanted to see the orchard in bloom once more before we left." "We?" Martha questioned, catching the pronoun. "If you'll permit me, I'd like to accompany your family to Philadelphia. The Congress will need reliable accounts from the countryside when they vote on independence. Your experience, your family's sacrifice, should be among the stories they hear." Martha looked from Hayes to her children, who watched this exchange with interest, and finally to her farm, the land that had sustained her family for over a decade. The morning sun illuminated the apple blossoms, making them glow like countless small beacons. "We'll return," she said, as much to herself as to Hayes, "when independence is secured." "Of that, Mrs. Lawson, I have no doubt," Hayes replied, helping. "Thomas, climb into the wagon." As their wagon pulled away from Willow Creek, Martha looked back at her blossoming orchard, trees temporarily left behind, but not abandoned. In her lap, she held the pouch of seeds James had collected, symbols of their intention to return and rebuild once liberty was secured. What had begun as one captain's plan to save a widow's farm had blossomed, like her apple trees, into something far greater, a family's contribution to the birth of a nation and the promise that future generations would harvest the fruits of freedom they had helped plant. Thank you for joining Martha and her family on their journey through the American Revolution. If you enjoyed this tale of courage, sacrifice, and the ordinary heroes who helped shape our nation, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of heroism throughout history. From untold Revolutionary War accounts to Civil War bravery and beyond, we bring history to life one story at a time.